opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Good day, everybody. This is UCY.tv. Excuse me. It's the 30th of July 2016. This is the Solvinur event. I am your host, Walter, coming to you from Holland. You can call in 718-717-8296. 718-717-8296. Or, if you have Skype, you can contact me at Solvinur, SOLVINUR, and that will also get you on the air live. It's 4 p.m. in the Netherlands, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So this is not a podcast. Yeah. How you doing, guys? What's up, everybody? I'm rolling a ciggy here. So this is supposed to be Brave New World, Part 7, and we will undoubtedly get into this, but that's why I said this is not a podcast. You know, this is live radio. Anything can happen. People can call in, you know. And perhaps, who knows, might be some new people listening. There's people in the chat anyway at ucy.tv. You can find the chat link. Some people have already gathered. Hi guys, Captain and Jen, but he's been there for 2 days and 17 hours. So. Grump, hey buddy. Matty also seems AFK. Otto, I know he's there. How you doing, buddy? Thanks for the comment on the YouTube. And surely you jest. There you are. And 3 anons. So, in case you're never heard this before, which I doubt, but the reason why I started making radio was to try to reach more people and give them some information. That's really the basic reason. But it's hard to reach a lot of people. You know, it usually takes a lot of money. And this kind of radio that we're doing now is advertisement free, thanks to Jules. So, you know, go to ucy.tv and find the donate button all the way at the bottom. That, however, so, you know, that's no longer a valid argument to be making radio. There have been a lot of these radio stations going up and some of them disappearing, others staying longer, having a longer life. And there doesn't seem to be much growth in amounts of people that are reached, right? If some idea would have caught on, then there would be hundreds of people in the chat right now, see? But there's not, which means nobody's listening. Basically, you know? I don't want to sound negative or anything, but that's just how it is. So, that made me turn a little bit more to other more interesting topics like mythology. I talked a lot about on air in the past. And we touched a little on philosophy. We dug into the trivium, which is still a useful topic to do. And it's been fun because, at least with the small people that are there, you can have a quote-unquote normal conversation, right? Because I can't have a normal conversation with anybody else but the people that I know from the internet. Not in my neighborhood anyway. I have to go like all the way up to Groningen perhaps to have even an idea of what a normal conversation would look like. This is one philosopher friend I have there who lives there. And I wouldn't call him asleep, let's put it that way, but he's all for the New World Order, so how about that, huh? In the past I was very radical about that, and I would call him a traitor philosopher, you know. So, one of the things that were like interesting in the past were books for like 1984, some Brave New World, and I dug into also books about physics. That was long ago in the it must have been like 83 or so, or 80, somewhere around there. Nigel Kaldar came out with a book, Key to the Universe. And I already knew better English because of my 2 years in Canada, so I was able to read it because it wasn't in Dutch. And it explained about the inner parts of protons and neutrons, and up quarks and down quarks, magic, things like that. Or was it in Dutch? Might have been in Dutch. Anyway, so all kinds of interesting stuff out there. This lighter doesn't work. This one. Gonna have to buy me some new lighters pretty soon. So, if you wanna call in, 718-717-8296. Let's get into Brave New World, where we left off last week, when Lenina was called away by the Arch Community Songstar. Obediently, but unsmiling and wholly insensible. Let's see. Need to adjust some windows here. is, there we go. It should be doable. Obediently, but unsmiling, and wholly insensible of the honor done to her. This is the last paragraph we read last week, I think. Without elation, Lenina walked after him out of the room. The other guests followed at a respectful interval. Then the last of them slammed the door. Bernard was alone. Punctured, utterly deflated, he dropped into a chair and, covering his face with his hands, began to weep. A few minutes later, however, he thought better of it and took 4 tablets of Soma. Upstairs in his room, the savage was reading Romeo and Juliet. Lenina and the arch-community songster stepped out to the roof of Lambeth Palace. Hurry up, my young friends. My young friend. Lenina, called the arch-songster impatiently from the lift gates. Lenina, who had lingered for a moment to look at the moon, dropped her eyes and came hurrying across the roof to rejoin him. A New Theory of Biology was the title of the paper which Mustafa Mond had just finished reading. He sat for some time, meditatively frowning, then picked up his pen and wrote across the title page. The author's mathematical treatment of the conception of purpose is novel and highly ingenious. Wow. But heretical and, so far as the present social order is concerned, dangerous and potentially subversive. Not to be published, he underlined the words. The author will be kept under supervision. His transference to the Marine Biology Station of St. Helena may become necessary. A pity, he thought, as he signed his name. It was a masterly piece of work, but once you began admitting explanations in terms of purpose, well, you didn't know what the result might be. It was the sort of idea that might easily decondition the more unsettled minds among the higher castes. They're talking about, I'm interrupting here. They're talking about telos here. I'll type it in the chat. I've done this before. It's not for nothing that I do that again. It needs to be emphasized. I think it's very important. Ethos, which means purpose. It's from Latin, I think. And it has to do with philosophy. I think ethos belongs... I think it ties at least to metaphysics. Purpose. It influences or ties to epistemology. So it has influences or ties to the first 2 branches of philosophy, metaphysics and epistemology. And as far as ethics goes, in other words, as far as how you're supposed to act goes, how you ought to be, ethos has also its influence of ethos as ethics. But telos has also its influence, because if you have what then is called theological view, which means that you think that everything around you has its purpose, and when you start looking out in the world, you see in the garden, for instance, an apple tree or a pear tree or raspberries or grains that one could use. Your thinking could be that this tree is there to provide the fruit that you can eat. I don't think there is any problem with that line of thinking. If you think there is, then call in and tell me that it's just a coincidence that we can eat all these fruits from all these trees. Right? So, to say that things have a purpose, or in other words, a telos, has some implications. Namely, and of course, besides the apple tree, you can find many more things in nature that have a purpose. I would even suggest that there is no thing in nature that does not have a purpose. But if that is your, what kind of axiom is that? And what branch does that belong anyway? I suppose it should be in the epistemological side. How do you know? But there is an axiom that says everything has a purpose, and that could explain some things as to how do you know, right? But that then implies that for most cases, for most people, that your life also has a purpose. See? And that's something that that's told to me anyway. Philosophers have been struggling with for thousands of years. I am a philosopher myself, right? I dare call myself a philosopher myself. And when you're talking about purpose, I don't think you can how do I put this? Alleen op jezelf betrekken. Hoe zeg ik dat op zijn Engels? How do I put that in English? When you're talking about the purpose of life, you shouldn't, take that personal as into your life, because if there is a purpose for humans being on Earth, it's not only for you, right? It's for everybody, and in all times. If there is a purpose to human life, then that same purpose was also there 12,000 years ago, when we were supposedly still using spears and axes and knives and sharp flint to as tools, right? Because if that's in your philosophy, you say that everything in nature has a purpose, then that had to have been like that 10,000 or 100,000 years ago also. Right? You can't say at a certain point nature began to be purposeful. That doesn't make sense. It has always had a purpose then. Right? So you should, if you want to find a purpose, you would have to include that too. And when you include that, you have to include the animals. You have to include the plants. If you want to, give a useful explanation of what is the purpose of life. Not your personal life. I don't think that is, that might not, I'm not sure, okay, let's put it that way. I'm not sure that is a valid question. Yeah. Especially not when you look at mass culture today, what does an individual matter? It's like a school of fish is going in the same direction, right? Hold on, I need to fix this lighter. Oh, blah, blah. It's like a school of fish that, they all go in the same direction. What does one individual matter, right? Refilling my lighter. Hold on, guys. That's what you get, live radio. 718-717-8296 if you want to join. 718-717-8296. Alright, so a teleological view opens up all kinds of questions about what a human life is supposed to be like. And that's what is not wanted in Brave New Worlds, you see. Because everything there is preordained. You're not even born if they don't have a purpose for you. They wouldn't decant you if they hadn't a purpose for you. In the sense that you will be conditioned to be of a certain class, like in a caste system. Which is what we have today for most people. Made a mistake a couple of events ago. I was talking about fine arts and as in regards to the 7 liberal arts, right? Further deconstruction into fine arts, and that was used to control the people. I was using the wrong term there. Fine arts is more like sculpture and things like that. There must have been something else arts called. I was talking about metallurgy, architecture, in the sense that they teach people how to build things. Lead things, the what do you call them, the sewer. The system, as it was called in Rome, I think. The sewer, right? So you need all kinds of craftspeople to keep this city, because that's what it's all about. It's about the city, right? To keep this city alive. Right? So those are the normal, the skilled people as we used to know them in the past. That we used to have schools here in the Netherlands. I think they diminished very much. There are still a couple of them, but they've been diminished. That used to teach you all kinds of skills. I remember that. I think that my welding teacher said that this whole class would be ending soon because they wouldn't be teaching people how to weld anymore. And all of that kind of things are going away, partly due to new techniques, right? New technical advancements. And that does create, like Nathan Fraser says, who's also on UCY.tv, that does create new jobs also. And he was arguing against people that say that machines would take away all the jobs, and I don't see the problem with that anyway, but he said that new technology also creates new jobs, which is true. But all this skilled schooling is just a way of culture creation. That's how our culture is made, because of the education that you get. Alright, did I fix this lighter? Yay! I did. And so in this caste system, right, they mention that also here in this sentence, decondition the more unsettled minds among the higher castes. In this caste system, people are so conditioned that there's only one way possible. Everything is predestined. Okay. That the goal, I'm continuing here, that the goal was somewhere beyond, somewhere outside the present human sphere, that the purpose of life was not the maintenance of well-being, but some intensification and refining of consciousness, some enlargement of knowledge, which was, the controller reflected, quite possibly true, but not in the present circumstance, admissible. He picked up his pen again and, under the words, "not to be published," drew a second line, thicker and blacker than the first, then sighed. What fun it would be, he thought, if one didn't have to think about happiness. With closed eyes, his face shining with rapture, John was softly declaiming to vacancy, "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night, like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear, beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear." The golden tea lay shining on Lenina's bosom. Sportively, the arch community songster caught hold of it. Sportively he pulled. "I think," said Lenina suddenly, breaking a long silence, "I'd better take a couple of grams of soma." Bernard, by this time, was fast asleep and smiling at the private paradise of his dreams. Smiling. But inexorably, every 30 seconds, the minute head of the electric clock above his head jumped forward with an almost impeccable click. And it was morning. Bernard was back among the miseries of space and time. It was It was in the lowest spirits that he taxied across to his work at the conditioning center. The intoxication of success had evaporated. He was soberly his old self, and by contrast with the temporary balloon of these last weeks, the old self seemed unprecedentedly heavier than the surrounding atmosphere. To this deflated Bernard the Savage, tonation all wrong. To this deflated Bernard the Savage showed himself unexpectedly sympathetic. "You're more like what you were at Malpais," he said, when Bernard had told him his plaintive story. "Do you remember when we first talked together, outside the little house? You're like what you were then." "Because I'm unhappy again, that's why." "Well, I'd rather be unhappy than have the sort of false, lying happiness you were having here." "I like that," said Bernard bitterly. "But it's you who were the cause of it all, refusing to come to my party and so turning them all against me." He knew that what he was saying was absurd in its injustice. He admitted inwardly, and at last even aloud, the truth of all that the savage now said about the worthlessness of friends who could be turned upon so slight a provocation into persecuting enemies. Wow. But in spite of this knowledge and these admissions, in spite of the fact that his friends' support and sympathy were now his only comfort, Bernard continued perversely to nourish, along with his quite genuine affection, a secret grievance against the savage, to mediate a campaign of small revenges to be wreaked upon him. Nourishing a grievance against the arch community songster was useless. There was no possibility of being revenged on the chief bottler or the assistant predestinator. As a victim, the savage possessed for Bernard this enormous superiority over the others, that he was accessible. One of the principal functions of a friend is to suffer, in a mild and symbolic form, the punishments that we should like, but are unable to inflict upon our enemies. Wow, what kind of thinking is that, huh? Bernard's other victim friend was Helmholtz. When discomfited, he came and asked once more for the friendship which, in his prosperity, he had not thought it worth his while to preserve. Helmholtz gave it, and gave it without a reproach, without a comment, as though he had forgotten that he had ever been at a quarrel. Touched, Bernard felt himself at the same time humiliated by this magnanimity, a magnanimity the more extraordinary and therefore the more humiliating in that it owed nothing to Soma and everything to Helmholtz's character. It was Helmholtz of daily life who forgot and forgave, not the Helmholtz of a half-gram holiday. Bernard was duly grateful. It was an enormous comfort to have his friend again, and also duly resurrectful? I don't know what that is. It would be pleasure to take some revenge on Helmholtz for his generosity. Wow. At their first meeting after the estrangement, Bernard poured out the tale of his miseries and accepted consolation. It was not till some days later that he learned, to his surprise and with a twinge of shame, that he was not the only one who had been in trouble. Helmholtz had also come into conflict with authority. Yeah. Hold on, guys. It was over some rhymes, he explained. I was giving my usual course of advanced emotional engineering for third-year students. Advanced emotional engineering. 12 lectures, with which the 7th is about rhymes. On use of the rhymes in moral propaganda and advertisement, to be precise. Moral propaganda and advertisement. I think they've pretty much studied that to as far as they could get it. Marketeers. There's a video out there. I won't be able to get it for you. It's been too long. But there comes this woman on a stage. She's sitting in for I don't know how many 100 people, not thousands, just a couple of hundred, I guess, for this kind of. I'm not sure if it was a TV show, but it was about giving a presentation, and she was talking about marketing and the tricks that they were using. And when she finally ended with something, and the people, they were enthusiastic when at first, when she explained some of the things. And when at the end of the video, it's like 8 minutes or something, she says that it's all to control you, or something to that effect. The important word meaning being you, when she points to the public, they all, they were stunned. In other words, during this whole explanation that she gave in the first 7 minutes, they weren't even thinking that it's a war on them, right? Continuing, I always illustrate my lecture with a lot of technical examples. This time I thought I'd give them one I'd just written myself. Pure madness, of course, but I couldn't resist it. He laughed. I was curious to see what their reactions would be. Besides, he added more gravely, I wanted to do a bit of propaganda. I was trying to engineer them into feeling as I'd felt when I wrote the rhymes. Ford, he laughed again. What an outcry there was. The principal had me up and threatened to hand me the immediate sack. I'm a marked man. But what were your rhymes? Bernard asked. They were about being alone. Bernard's eyebrows went up. I'll recite them to you if you like. And Helmholtz began. Yesterday's committee. Sticks, but a broken drum. Midnight in the city. Flutes in a vacuum. Shut lips, sleeping faces. Every stopped machine. The dumb and littered places where crowds have been. All silences rejoice. Weep, loudly or low. Speak, but with the voice of whom I do not know. Absence, say, of Susans. Absentee of Egerias. Arms and respective bosoms. Lips and posteriors. Slowly form a presence. Whose? And I ask, of what? So absurd an essence, that something which is not, nevertheless should populate, empty night more solidly than that with which we copulate. Why should it seem so squalidly? Well, I gave them that as example, and they reported me to the principal. I'm not surprised, said Bernard. It's flatly against all their sleep teaching. Remember, they've had at least 250,000 warnings against solitude. I know, but I thought I'd like to see what the effect would be. Well, you've seen now. Helmholtz only laughed. I feel, he said after a silence, as though I were just beginning to have something to write about, as though I were beginning to be able to use that power I feel I've got inside me, that extra latent power. Something seems to be coming to me. In spite of all his troubles, he seemed, Bernard thought, profoundly happy. Helmholtz and the savage took to one another at once, so cordially indeed that Bernard felt a sharp pang of jealousy. In all these weeks he had never come to I don't know, this may be a typo. I'll just read it like it's stated here. In all these weeks, he had never come to so close an intimacy with the savage as Helmholtz immediately achieved. Watching them, listening to their talk, he found himself sometimes resentfully wishing that he had never brought them together. He was ashamed of his jealousy and alternately made efforts of will and took Soma to keep himself from feeling it. But the efforts were not very successful, and between the Soma holidays there were, of necessity, intervals. The odious sentiment kept on returning. At this third meeting with the savage, Helmholtz recited his rhymes on solitude. "What do you think of them?" he asked when he had done. The savage shook his head. "Listen to this," was his answer, and unlocking the drawer in which he kept his mouse-eaten book, he opened and read, "Let the bird of the loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree, herald set and trumpet be." Helmholtz listened with a growing excitement. At the sole Arabian tree, he started. At "Thou shrieking harbinger," he smiled with sudden pleasure. At "Every fowl of tyrant wing," the blood rushed up into his cheeks. But a defunctive music, he turned pale and trembled with an unprecedented emotion. The savage read on. Property was thus appalled, that the self was not the same. Single nature's double name. Neither two nor one was called. Reason in itself confounded, saw division grow together. "Orgy porgy," said Bernard, interrupting the reading with a loud, unpleasant laugh. "It's just a solidarity service hymn." He was revenging himself on his two friends for liking one another more than they liked him. In the course of their next 2 or 3 meetings he frequently repeated this little act of vengeance. It was simple, and, since both Helmholtz and the savage were dreadfully pained by the shattering and defilement of a favorite poetic crystal, extremely effective. In the end, Helmholtz threatened to kick him out of the room if he dared to interrupt again. And yet, strangely enough, the next interruption, the most disgraceful of all, came from Helmholtz himself. The savage was reading Romeo and Juliet aloud. Reading, for all the time he was seeing himself as Romeo and Lenina as Juliet, with an intense and quivering passion. Helmholtz had listened to the scene of the lovers' first meeting with a puzzled interest. The scene in the orchard had delighted him with its poetry, but the sentiments expressed had made him smile. Getting into such a state about having a girl, it seemed rather ridiculous. But taken detail by verbal detail, what a superb piece of emotional engineering! "That old fellow," he said, "he makes our best propaganda technicians look absolutely silly." The savage smiled triumphantly and resumed his reading. All went tolerably well until, in the last scene of the third act, Capulet and Lady Capulet began to bully Juliet to marry Paris. Helmholtz had been restless throughout the entire scene, but when, pathetically memed by the savage, Juliet cried out, "Is there no pity sitting in the clouds, that sees into the bottom of my grief? O sweet my mother, cast me not away. Delay this marriage for a month, a week, or, if you do not, make the bridal bed in that dim monument where Tybalt lies." When Juliet said this, Helmholtz broke out in an explosion of uncontrollable guffawing. The mother and father, grotesque obscenity, forcing the daughter to have someone she didn't want, and the idiotic girl not saying that she was having someone else, whom, for the moment at any rate, she preferred. In its smutty absurdity, the situation was irresistibly comical. He had managed, with a heroic effort, to hold down the mounting pressure of his hilarity. But, sweet mother, in the savage's tremulous tone of anguish, and the reference to Tybalt lying dead, but evidently uncremated and wasting his phosphorus on a dim monument, were too much for him. He laughed and laughed till the tears streamed down his face, quenchingly laughed while, pale with a sense of outrage, the savage looked at him at the top of his book and then, as the laughter still continued, closed it indignantly, got up and, with a gesture of one who removes his pearls from before swine, locked it away in its drawer. And yet, said Helmholtz, when having recovered breath enough to apologize, he had mollified the savage into listening to his explanations. I know quite well that one needs ridiculous, mad situations like that. One can't write really well about anything else. Why was that old fellow such a marvelous propaganda technician? Because he had so many... where's my tobacco? Here it is. Because he had so many insane, excruciating things to get excited about. You've got to be hurt and upset, otherwise you can't think of the really good, penetrating, X-rayish phrases. But fathers and mothers? He shook his head. You can't expect me to keep a straight face about fathers and mothers. And who's going to get excited about a boy having a girl or not having her? The savage winced, but Helmholtz, who was staring pensively at the floor, saw nothing. No, he concluded with a sigh, I won't do it. We need some other kind of madness and violence. But what? What? Where can one find it? He was silent. Then, shaking his head, I don't know, he said at last. I don't know. Blah, blah. Yeah, that sounded like the end of a chapter. And it is... We're on to number 13, chapter 13. Henry Foster loomed up through the twilight of the embryo store. Like to come to a feelie this evening? Lenina shook her head without speaking. Going out with someone else? It interested him to know which of his friends was being had by which other. Is it Benito? He questioned. She shook her head again. Henry detected the weariness in those purple eyes, the pallor beneath that glaze of lupus, the sadness at the corners of the unsmiling crimson mouth. You're not feeling ill, are you? He asked, a trifle anxiously, afraid that she might be suffering from one of the few remaining infectious diseases. Yet once more Lenina shook her head. Anyhow, you ought to go and see the doctor, said Henry. A doctor a day keep the jams away. He added, heartily, driving home his hypnopathic adage with a clap on the shoulder. Perhaps you need a pregnancy substitute, he suggested, or else extra strong VPS treatment. Sometimes, the standard passion surrogate isn't quite... Oh, for Ford's sake, said Lenina, breaking her stubborn silence. Shut up! And she turned back to her neglected embryos. A VPS treatment indeed. She would have laughed if she hadn't been on the point of crying, as though she hadn't got enough VP on her own. Of her own. She sighed profoundly as she refilled her syringe. John, she murmured to herself. John. Then, my Ford. She wondered, have I given this one sleeping sickness injection or haven't I? She simply couldn't remember. In the end, she decided not to run the risk of letting it have a second dose and move down the line to the next bottle. 22 years, 8 months and 4 days from that moment, a promising young Alpha Minus administrator at Mumza was to die of trypanosomiasis, the first case for over half a century. Sighing, Lenina went on with her work. An hour later, in the changing room, Fanny was energetically protesting. But it's absurd to let yourself get into a state like this. Simply absurd, she repeated. And what about? A man. One man. But he's the one I want. As though there weren't millions of other men in the world. But I don't want them. How can you know till you've tried? I have tried. But how many? Asked Fanny, shrugging her shoulders contemptuously. 1, 2? Dozens. But, shaking her head, it wasn't any good, she added. Well, you must persevere, said Fanny sententiously. But it was obvious that her confidence in her own prescriptions had been shaking. Nothing can be achieved without perseverance. But meanwhile, don't think of him. I can't help it. Take Soma then. I do. Well, go on. But in the intervals I still like him. I shall always like him. Well, if that's the case, said Fanny with decision, why don't you just go and take him, whether he wants it or no? But if you knew how terribly queer he was, all the more reason for taking a firm line. It's all very well to say that. Don't stand any nonsense. Act. Fanny's voice was a trumpet. She must have been a YWFA lecturer giving an evening talk to adolescent beta minuses. Yes, act. At once. Do it now. I'd be scared, said Lenina. Well, you've only got to take half a gram of Soma first, and now I'm going to have my bath. She marched off, trailing her towel. The bell rang, and the savage, who was impatiently hoping that Helmholtz would come that afternoon, for having at last made up his mind to talk to Helmholtz about Lenina, he could not bear to postpone his confidences a moment longer, jumped up and ran to the door. I had a premonition it was you, Helmholtz, he shouted as he opened. On the threshold, in a white acetate satin sailor suit and with a round white cape rakishly tilted over her left ear, stood Lenina. "Oh," said the savage, as though someone had struck him a heavy blow. Half a gram had been enough to make Lenina forget her fears and her embarrassment. "Hello, John," she said, smiling, and walked past him into the room. Automatically he closed the door and followed her. Lenina sat down. There was a long silence. "You don't seem very glad to see me, John," she said at last. "Not glad?" The savage looked at her reproachfully, then suddenly fell on his knees before her and, taking Lenina's hand, reverently kissed it. "Not glad? Oh, if you only knew," he whispered, and, venturing to raise his eyes to her face, "Admired Lenina," he went on, "indeed the top of admiration, worth what's dearest in the world." She smiled at him with a luscious tenderness. "Oh, you so perfect!" She was leaning towards him with parted lips. "So perfect and so peerless and created." Nearer and nearer. Of every creature's best. Still nearer. The savage suddenly scrambled to his feet. "That's why," he said, speaking with an averted face, "I wanted to do something first. I mean, to show I was worthy of you. Not that I could ever really be that, but at any rate to show it wasn't absolutely unworthy. I wanted to do something." "Why should you think it necessary?" Lenina began, but left the sentence unfinished. There was a note of irritation in her voice. When one has leant forward, nearer and nearer, with parted lips, only to find oneself quite suddenly as a clumsy oaf scrambling to his feet, leaning towards nothing at all, well, there is a reason. Even with half a gram of soma circulating in one's bloodstream, a genuine reason for annoyance. At Malpais, the savage was incoherently mumbling. "You had to bring the skin of a mountain lion. I mean, you wanted to marry someone, or else a wolf?" "There aren't any lions in England," Lenina almost snapped. "And even if there were," the savage added, with sudden contemptuous resentment, "people would kill them out of helicopters, I suppose, with poison gas or something. I wouldn't do that, Lenina." He squared his shoulders. He ventured to look at her, and was met with a stare of annoyed incomprehension. Confused. "I'll do anything," he went on, more and more incoherently. "Anything you tell me. There be some sports are painful, you know, but their labor delight in them sets off. That's what I feel. I mean, I'd sweep the floor if you wanted." "But we've got vacuum cleaners here," said Lenina in bewilderment. "It isn't necessary." "No, of course it isn't necessary, but some kinds of baseness are nobly undergone. I'd be like to undergo something nobly, don't you see?" "But if there are vacuum cleaners, that's not the point. An epsilon semi-morons too work them," she went on. "Well, really, why?" "Why? But for you, just to show that I—" "And what on earth vacuum cleaners have got to do with lions?" "To show how much, or lions being glad to see me." She was getting more and more exasperated. "How much I love you, Lenina," he brought out almost desperately. An emblem of the inner tide of startled elation, the blood rushed up into Lenina's cheeks. "Do you mean it, John?" But I hadn't meant to say so, cried the savage, clasping his hands in a kind of agony. Not until... Listen, Lenina, in Malpay people get married. Get what? The irritation had begun to creep back into her voice. What was he talking about now? For always. They make a promise to live together for always. What a horrible idea! Lenina was genuinely shocked. Outliving beauties outward with a mind that cloth renews swifter than blood decays? What? It's like that in Shakespeare too. If thou caust break her virgin knot, before all sanctimonious ceremonies may with full and holy rite. For Fort's sake, John, talk sense. Alright, so it's been 5 p.m. 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is UCY.tv. I'm your host, Solvinur. That's my nickname. Wouter Hendricks would be my Dutch name. And you can call in if you like. 718-717-8296. If you've listened to the last hour, you've noticed there's no ads. UCY.tv, all the way at the bottom is a donate button if you can afford to. And I was looking to play some Poker Face, and I thought I had it set already, but now I can't find it. Where did I hear this? Let's play some Poker Face, guys. Have a little break, and then we'll pick this up in the second hour. This is 2012 at Freedom Palooza. Check these guys out at pokerface.com. Excuse me.
This is a public service announcement. Your country is being sold out right from under you, and your government is doing everything to make that possible. You are nothing but sons of the global plantation. What are you going to do about it? You're going to continue being a slave. You're going to wake the F up. I speak. Or you swallow. Or you follow.
Pokerface.
Check them out at pokerface.com. Welcome back, everybody. Let's pick this up where we left off. For Ford's sake, John, talk sense. I can't understand a word you say. First it's vacuum cleaners, then it's nuts. You're driving me crazy. She jumped up and, as though afraid that he might run away from her physically as well as with his mind, caught him by the wrist. Answer me this question. Do you really like me or don't you? There was a moment's silence. Then in a very low voice, I love you more than anything in the world, he said. Then why on earth didn't you say so? She cried. And so intense was her exasperation that she drove her sharp nails into the skin of his wrist. Instead of drivelling away about knots and vacuum cleaners and lions and making me miserable for weeks and weeks. She released his hand and flung it angrily away from her. If I didn't like you so much, she said, I'd be furious with you. And suddenly her arms were around his neck. He felt her lips soft against his own, so deliciously soft, so warm and electric that inevitably he found himself thinking of embraces in 3 weeks in a helicopter. Oh, the stereoscopic blonde and the more real black amour. Horror! He fired to disengage himself, but Lenina tightened her embrace. Why didn't you say so? She whispered, drawing back her face to look at him. Her eyes were tenderly reproachful. The murkiest den, the most opportune place, the voice of conscience thundered poetically. The strongest suggestion our worser genius can shall never melt mine honor into lust. Never, he resolved. You silly boy, she was saying, I wanted you so much, and if you wanted me too, why didn't you? But Lenina, he began protesting, and as she immediately untwined her arms, as she stepped away from him, he thought for a moment that she had taken his unspoken hint. But when she unbuckled her white patent cartridge belt and hung it carefully over the back of a chair, he began to suspect that he had been mistaken. Lenina, he repeated apprehensively. Morning, Matty. She put her hand to her neck and gave a long vertical pull. Her white sailor's blouse was ripped to the hem. Suspicion condensed into a too solid certainty. Lenina, what are you doing? Zip, zip. Her answers were wordless. She stepped out of her bell-bottom trousers. Her zippicamniks were a pale shell pink. The arch community songster's golden tea dangled at her breast. For those milk paps that through the window bars bore at men's eyes. The singing, thundering, magical words made her seem doubly dangerous. Doubly dangerous, doubly alluring. Soft, but how piercing. Boring and drilling into reason, tunneling through resolution. The strongest oaths are straw to the fire in the blood. Be more abstemious or else. Zip. The rounded pinkness fell apart like a neatly divided apple. A wriggle of the arms, a lifting first of the right foot, then the left. The zippicamniks were lying lifeless and as though deflated on the floor. Still wearing her shoes and socks, and her rakishly tilted round white cap, she advanced towards him. Darling, if only you said so before, she held out her arms. But instead of also saying, darling, and holding out his arms, the savage retreated in terror, flapping his hands at her as though he were trying to scare away some intruding and dangerous animal. 4 backward steps, and was brought to bay against the wall. Sweet, said Lenina, laying her hands on his shoulders, pressed herself against him. Put your arms around me, she commanded. Hug me till you drug me, honey. She too had poetry at her command, knew the words they sang, and were spells and beat drums. Kiss me, she closed her eyes, she let her voice sink to a sleepy murmur. Kiss me till I'm in a coma, hug me, honey, snugly. The savage caught her by the wrists, tore her hands from his shoulders, thrust her roughly away at arm's length. Oh, you're hurting me, She was suddenly silent. Terror had made her forget the pain. Opening her eyes, she had seen his face. No, not his face, a ferocious stranger's, pale, distorted, twitching with some insane, inexplicable fury. Aghast, but what is it, John? She whispered. He did not answer, but only stared into her face with those mad eyes. The hands that held her wrists were trembling. He breathed deeply and irregularly. Faint almost, the imperceptibility, but appalling, she suddenly heard the kneading of his teeth. What is it? She almost screamed. And as though awakened by her cry, he caught her by the shoulders and shook her. Whore! He shouted. Whore! Impudent strumpet! Oh, don't, she protested, in a voice grotesquely tremulous by his shaking. Whore! Please! Damned whore! A gram is better, she began. The savage pushed her away with such force that she staggered and fell. Go, he shouted, standing over her menacingly. Get out of my sight or I'll kill you. He clenched his fists. Lenina raised her arm to cover her face. No, please don't, John. Hurry up, quick. One arm still raised, and following his every movement with a terrified eye, she scrambled to her feet, and still crouching, still covering her head, made a dash for the bathroom. The noise of that prodigious slap by which her departure was accelerated was like a pistol shot. Oh, Lenina bounded forward. Safely locked into the bathroom, she had leisure to take stock of her injuries. Standing with her back to the mirror, she twisted her head. Looking over her left shoulder, she could see the imprint of an open hand standing out distinct and crimson on the pearly flesh. Gingerly she rubbed the wounded spot. Outside, in the other room, the savage was striding up and down, marching to the drums and music of magical words. The wren goes to it, and the small gilded fly does lecher in my sight. Maddeningly they rumbled in his ears. The fichu nor the soiled horse goes to it with a more riotous appetite. Down from the waist they are centaurs, though woman all above, but to the girdle do the gods inherit. Beneath is all the fiends. There's hell, there's darkness, there's the sulphurous pit, burning, scalding, stench, consumption, fire, pain. Give me an ounce of civet, good apothecary. To sweeten my imagination. John, ventured a small, ingratiating voice from the bathroom. John, O thou wheat, who are so lovely fair and smells so sweet that the sense ages all thee, was this most goodly book made to write whore upon? Heaven stops the nose at it. But her perfume still hung about him. His jacket was white with the powder that had scented her velvety body. Imprudent trumpet. The inexhaustible rhythm beat itself out. John, do you think I might have my clothes? He picked up the bell-bottomed trousers, the blouse, the zipacaminics, something like that. Open, he ordered, kicking the door. No, I won't. The voice was frightened and defiant. Well, how do you expect me to give them to you? Push them through the ventilator over the door. He did she suggested and returned to his uneasy pacing of the room. Imprudent strumpet. The devil luxury with his fat rump and potato finger. John. He would not answer. Fat rump and potato finger. John. What is it? He asked gruffly. I wonder if you'd mind giving me my Malthusian belt. Lenina sat, listening to the footsteps in the room, wondering, as she listened, how long he was likely to go trampling up and down like that, whether she would have to wait until he left the flat, or if it would be safe, after allowing his madness a reasonable time to subside, to open the bathroom door and make a dash for it. She was interrupted in the midst of these uneasy speculations by the sound of the telephone bell ringing in the other room. Abruptly the trampling ceased. She heard the voice of the savage parleying with silence. "Hello? Yes? If I do not usurp myself, I am." "Yes, didn't you hear me say so? Mr. Savage speaking." "What? Who's ill? Of course it interests me." "But is it serious? Is she really bad? I'll go at once." "Not in her rooms anymore? Where has she been taken?" "Oh my God, what's the address?" 3 Park Lane, is that it? 3? Thanks. Lenina heard the click of the replaced receiver, then hurrying steps. A door slammed. There was silence. Was he really gone? With an infinity of precautions, she opened the door a quarter of an inch, peeped through the crack, was encouraged by the view of emptiness, opened a little further, and put her whole head out, finally tiptoed into the room, stood for a few seconds with strongly beating heart, listening, then darted to the front door, opened, slipped through, slammed, ran. Did she forget her belt? It was not till she was in the lift and actually dropping down the well that she began to feel herself secure. And that was the end of chapter 13. Moving on to 14 though. Chapter 14, Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. The Park Lane Hospital for the Dying was a 60-story tower of primrose tiles. As the savage stepped out of his taxicopter, a convoy of gaily colored aerial hearses rose whirring from the roof and darted away across the park. Westwards, bound for the Slaw crematorium. That's the end of the sentence. At the lift gates, the presiding porter gave him the information he required, and he dropped down the ward 81, a galloping senility ward, the porter explained, on the 17th floor. It was a large room, bright with sunshine and yellow paint, and containing 20 beds, all occupied. Linda was dying in company and with all the modern conveniences. The air was continuously alive with gay synthetic melodies. At the foot of every bed, confronting its moribund occupant, was a television box. Television was left on, a running tap from morning till night. Every quarter of an hour, with prevailing perfume of the room, was automatically changed. "We try," explained the nurse, who had taken charge of the savage at the door, "we try to create a thoroughly pleasant atmosphere here, something between a first-class hotel and a Feely Palace, if you take my meaning." "Where is she?" asked the savage, ignoring those polite explanations. The nurse was offended. "You're in a hurry," she said. "Is there any hope?" he asked. "You mean of her not dying?" He nodded. "No, of course there isn't. When somebody's sent here, there is no." Startled by the expression of distress on his pale face, she suddenly broke off. "Why, what's the matter?" she asked. She was not accustomed to this kind of thing in visitors. Not that there were many visitors anyhow, or any reason why there should be many visitors. "You're not feeling ill, are you?" He shook his head. "She's my mother," he said in a scarcely audible voice. The nurse glanced at him with startled, horrified eyes, then quickly looked away. From throat to temple she was all one hot blush. "Take me to her," said the savage, making an effort to speak in an ordinary tone. Still blushing, she led the way down the ward, faces still fresh and unwithered, for senility galloped so hard that it had no time to age the cheeks, only the heart and brain, turned as they passed. Their progress was followed by blank, incurious eyes of second infancy. The savage shuddered as he looked. Linda was lying in the last of the long row of beds next to the wall. Propped up on pillows, she was watching the semi-finals of the South American Ryman Surface Tennis Championship, which were being played in silent and diminished reproduction on the screen of the television box at the foot of the bed. Hither and thither, across their square of illuminated glass, the little figures noisily darted, like fish in an aquarium, the silent but agitated inhabitants of another world. Linda looked on, vaguely and uncomprehendingly smiling. Her pale, bloated face wore an expression of imbecile happiness. Every now and then her eyelids closed, and for a second she seemed to be dozing. Then, with a little start, she would wake up to the aquarium antics of the tennis champions, to the Supervox Wurlitzeriana rendering of "Hug me till you drug me, honey," to the warm draught of verbena that came blowing through the ventilator above her head, would wake to these things, or rather to a dream of which these things, transformed and embellished by the soma in her blood, were the marvelous constituents, and smile once more her broken and discolored smile of infantile contentment. "Well, I must go," said the nurse. "I've got my batch of children coming. Besides, there's number 3, she pointed up the ward. "Might go off any minute now." "Well, make yourself comfortable." She walked briskly away. The savage sat down beside the bed. "Linda," he whispered, taking her hand. At the sound of her name she turned. Her vague eyes brightened with recognition. She squeezed his hand. He smiled. Her lips moved. Then, quite suddenly, her head fell forward. She was asleep. He sat watching her, seeking through the tired flesh, seeking and finding that young bright face which had stooped over his childhood in Malpais. Remembering, and he closed his eyes, her voice, her movements, all the events of their life together. Step to Kukji to bury tea. How beautiful her singing had been, and those childish rhymes, how magically strange and mysterious. A, B, C, vitamin D, the fats in the liver, the cod's in the sea. He felt the hot tears welling up behind his eyelids as he recalled the words and Linda's voice as she repeated them. And then the reading lessons. The tot is in the pot, the cat is on the mat, and the elementary instructions for beta workers in the embryo store. And long evenings by the fire, or, in summertime, on the roof of the little house. When she told him those stories about the other place, outside the reservation, that beautiful, beautiful other place, whose memory as of a heaven, a paradise of goodness and loveliness, he still kept whole and intact, undefiled by contact with the reality of this real London, this actual civilized men and women. A sudden noise of shrill voices made him open his eyes. After hastily brushing away the tears, look round. What seemed an interminable stream of identical 8-year-olds, male twins, was pouring into the room. Twin after twin after twin, they came in, a nightmare. Their faces, their repeated face, for there was only one between the lot of them, puggishly stared, all nostrils and pale goggling eyes. Their uniform was khaki, and their mouths hung open. Squealing and chattering they entered. In a moment it seemed the ward was maggoty with them. They swarmed between the beds, clambered over, crawled under, peeped into the television boxes, made faces at the patients. Linda, astonished and rather alarmed then, a group stood clustered at the foot of her bed, staring with the frightened and stupid curiosity of animals suddenly confronted by the unknown. "Oh, look," they spoke in low, scared voices. "Whatever is the matter with her? Why is she so fat?" They had never seen a face like hers before, had never seen a face that was not youthful and taut-skinned, a body that had ceased to be slim and upright. All these moribund sexagenarians had the appearance of childish girls. At 44, Linda seemed, by contrast, a monster of flaccid and distorted senility. "Isn't she awful?" came the whispered comments. "Look at her teeth." Yeah, in about half an hour, RLM Radio, Grammy Mary, has the dork table open. You can join there too if you like. You know, this is your radio, guys. You can call in 718-717-8296. It's live radio, so, you know, you can call in if you want. Blah, blah, where were we? "Isn't she awful?" came the whispered comments. "Look at her teeth." Suddenly, from under the bed, a pug-faced twin popped up between John's chair and the wall. And began peering into Linda's sleeping face. "I say," he began, but the sentence ended prematurely in a squeal. The savage had seized him by the collar, lifted him clear off the chair, and, with a smart box on his ears, sent him howling away. His yells brought the head nurse hurrying to the rescue. "What have you been doing to him?" she demanded fiercely. "I won't have you striking the children." "Well then, keep them away from this bed." The savage voice was trembling with indignation. "What are these filthy little brats doing here at all? It's disgraceful." "Disgraceful? But what do you mean? They're being death conditioned. And I tell you," she warned him truculently, "if you have any more of your interference with their conditioning, I'll send for the porters and have you thrown out." The savage rose to his feet and took a couple of steps towards her. His movements and the expression on his face were so menacing that the nurse fell back in terror. With a great effort he checked himself and, without speaking, turned away and sat down again by the bed. Reassured, but with a dignity that was trifle shrill. Yeah. It's the same in Dutch. Shrill. Shrill. And uncertain. "I've wanted you," said the nurse. I warned you," said the nurse. "So mind." Still, she led the two inquisitive twins away and made them join in the game of Hunt the Zipper, which had been organized by one of the colleagues at the other end of the room. "Run along now and have your cup of caffeine solution, dear," she said to the other nurse. The exercise of authority restored her confidence, made her feel better. "Now, children," she called. Linda had stirred uneasily, had opened her eyes for a moment, looked vaguely around, and then once more dropped off to sleep. Sitting beside her, the savage tried hard to recapture his mood of a few minutes before. "A, B, C, vitamin D," he repeated to himself, as though the words were a spell that would restore the dead past to life. But the spell was ineffective. Obstinately, the beautiful memories refused to rise. There was only a hateful resurrection of jealousies and ugliness and miseries. Pope, with the blood trickling down from his cut shoulder, and Linda, hideously asleep, and the flies buzzing around, the spilled mescal on the floor beside the bed, and the boys calling those names as she passed. Ah, no, he shut his eyes. He shook his head in a strenuous denial of these memories. A, B, C, vitamin D, he tried to think of those times when he sat on her knees and she put her arms about him and sang, over and over again, rocking him to sleep. A, B, C, vitamin D. The supervox Wurlitzeriana had risen to a sobbing crescendo, and suddenly the verbena gave place, and the scent-circulating system, to an intense patchouli. Linda stirred, woke up, stared for a few seconds bewilderedly at the semi-finalists, then, lifting her face, sniffed once or twice at the newly perfumed air, and suddenly smiled. A smile of childish ecstasy. "Pope," she murmured, and closed her eyes. "Oh, I do so like it." She sighed and let herself sink back into the pillows. "But Linda," the savage spoke imploringly, "don't you know me?" He had tried so hard. He had done his very best. Why wouldn't she allow him to forget? He squeezed her lips, her limp hand, almost with violence, as though he would force her to come back from this dream of ignoble pleasures, from these base and hateful memories, back into the present, back into reality, the appalling present, the awful reality, but sublime, but significant, but desperately important, precisely because of the immense of that which made them so fearful. Don't you know me, Linda? He felt the faint answering pressure of her hand. The tears started into his eyes. He bent over her and kissed her. Her lips moved. Popeye, she whispered again, and it was as though he had a painful ordure thrown in his face. Anger suddenly boiled up in him. Balked for the second time. The passion of his grief had found another outlet, was transformed into a passion of agonized rage. "But I'm John," he shouted. And in his furious misery he actually caught her by her shoulder and shook her. Linda's eyes fluttered open. She saw him, knew him. John. But situated the real face, the real and violent hands, in an imaginary world, among the inward and private equivalents of patchouli and the superwurlitzer, among the transfigured memories and the strangely transposed sensations that constituted the universe of her dream. She knew him for John, her son, but fancied him as an intruder into the paradisal Malpais, where she had been spending her summer holiday with Popeye. He was angry because she liked Popeye. He was shaking her because Popeye was there in her bed, as though there were something wrong, as though all civilized people didn't do the same. Everyone belongs to everyone. Her voice suddenly died into an almost inaudible, breathless croaking. Her mouth fell open. She made a desperate effort to fill her lungs with air, but it was as though she had forgotten how to breathe. She tried to cry out, but no sound came. Only the terror of her staring eyes revealed what she was suffering. Her hands went to her throat, then clawed at the air she could no longer breathe, the air that, for her, had ceased to exist. The savage was on his feet, bent over her. "What is it, Linda? What is it?" His voice was imploring. It was as though he were begging to be reassured. The look she gave him was charged with an unspeakable terror, and it seemed to him reproach. She tried to raise herself in bed, but fell back onto the pillows. Her face was horribly distorted, her lips blue. The savage turned and ran up the ward. "Quick!" he shouted. "Quick!" Standing in the center of a ring of zipper-hunting twins, the head nurse looked round. The first moment's astonishment gave place, almost instantly, to disapproval. "Don't shout! Think of the little ones," she said, frowning. "You might decondition." "But what are you doing?" He had broken through the ring. "Be careful!" a child was yelling. "Quick!" He caught her by her sleeve, dragged her after him. "Quick, something's happened. I've killed her." By the time they were back at the end of the ward, Linda was dead. The savage stood for a moment in frozen silence, then fell on his knees beside the bed, and, covering his face with his hands, sobbed uncontrollably. The nurse stood irresolute, looking now and then at the kneeling figure by the bed. The scandalous exhibition! And now, poor children, at the twins who had stopped their hunting of the zipper and were staring from the other end of the ward, staring with all their eyes and nostrils at the shocking scene that was enacted around bed 20. Should she speak to him, try to bring him back to a sense of decency, remind him of where he was, of what fatal mischief he might do to these poor innocents, undoing all their wholesome death conditioning with this disgusting outcry, as though death were something terrible, as though anyone mattered as much as all that? It might give them the most disastrous ideas about the subject, might upset them into reacting in the entirely wrong, the utterly anti-social way. Well, those last couple of sentences were about the best that we've read in the last 1 hour and 3/4. Last paragraph. Lots in there. She stepped forward. She touched him on the shoulder. "Can't you behave?" she said in a low, angry voice. But, looking around, she saw that half a dozen twins were already on their feet and advancing down the ward. The circle was disintegrating. In another moment. No, the risk was too great. The whole group might be put back 6 or 7 months in its conditioning. She hurried back towards her menaced charges. "Now, who wants a chocolate eclair?" she asked in a loud, cheerful tone. "Me!" yelled the entire Bokanovsky group in chorus. Bed 20 was completely forgotten. "Oh God," the savage kept repeating to himself. In the chaos of grief and remorse that filled his mind, it was the only articulate word. "God," he whispered it aloud. "Whatever is he saying?" said a voice very near, distinct and shrill, through the warblings of the super-Wurlitzer. The savage... Hold on, guys. The savage violently started and, uncovering his face, looked around. 5 khaki twins, each with the stump of their long eclair in his right hand, and their identical faces, variously smeared with liquid chocolate, were standing in a row, puggily goggling at him. They met his eyes and simultaneously grinned. One of them pointed with his eclair butt. "Is she dead?" he asked. The savage stared at them for a moment in silence. Then in silence he rose to his feet. In silence slowly walked towards the door. "Is she dead?" repeated the inquisitive twin trotting at his side. The savage looked down at him and still without speaking pushed him away. The twin fell on the floor and began to howl. The savage did not even look round. And that's end of 14. I'm gonna... Hold on, guys. It brings us to 15. The menial staff of the Park Lane Hospital for the Dying consisted of 162 deltas divided into 2 Bokanovsky groups of 84 red-headed female and 78 dark dolichocephalic male twins, respectively. At 6, when their working day was over, the 2 groups assembled in the vestibule of the hospital and were served by the deputy sub-bursar with their soma ration. From the lift, the savage stepped out in the midst of them. but his mind was elsewhere, with death, with his grief and his remorse, mechanically, without consciousness of what he was doing. He began to shoulder his way through the crowd. Who are you pushing? Where do you think you're going? High, low, from a multitude of separate throats, only two voices squeaked or growled, repeated indefinitely as though by a train of mirrors, two faces, one a hairless and freckled moon haloed in orange, the other a thin, beaked bird mask, stubbly with 2 days' beard, turned angrily towards him. Their words, and, in his ribs, the sharp nudging of elbows, broke through his unawareness. He woke once more to external reality, looking round him, knew what he saw, he knew. Knew what he saw, knew it, with a sinking sense of horror and disgust for the recurrent delirium of his days and nights, the nightmare of swarming indistinguishable sameness. Twins. Like maggots they had swarmed defilingly over the mystery of Linda's death. Maggots again. But larger, full-grown, they now crawled across his grief and his repentance. He halted and, with bewildered and horrified eyes, stared round him at the khaki mob, in the midst of which, overtopping it by a full head, he stood. How many goodly creatures are there here? The singing words mocked him derisively. How beauteous mankind is, O brave new world! Soma distribution, shouted a loud voice. In good order, please. Hurry up there. A door had been opened. A table and a chair carried into the vestibule. The voice was that of a jaunty young alpha, who had entered carrying a black iron cash box. A murmur of satisfaction went up from the expectant twins. They forgot all about the savage. Their attention was now focused on the black cash box, which the young man had placed on the table, and was now in process of unlocking. The lid was lifted. "Oh," said all the 162 simultaneously, as though they were looking at fireworks. The young man took out the handful of tiny pill boxes. "Now," he said, peremptorily, "step forward, please. One at a time and no shoving." One at a time, with no shoving, the twins stepped forward. First 2 males, then a female, then another male, then 3 females, then the savage stood looking on. O brave new world! In his mind the singing words seemed to change their tone. They had mocked him through his misery and remorse, mocked him with how hideous a note of cynical derision. Fiendishly laughing, they had insisted on the low squalor, the nauseous ugliness of the nightmare. Now, suddenly, they trumpeted a call to arms. O brave new world! Miranda was proclaiming the possibility of loveliness, the possibility of transforming even the nightmare into something fine and noble. O brave new world! It was a challenge, a command. No shoving there now, shouted the deputy sub-bursar in a fury. Bursar. He slammed down the lid of his cash box. I shall stop the distribution unless I have good behavior. The deltas muttered, jostled one another a little, and then were still. The threat had been effective. Deprivation of soma, appalling thought. That's why do they put a dash there? Deprivation of soma, an appalling thought, right? That's better, said the young man, and reopened his cash box. Linda had been a slave. Linda had died. Others should live in freedom, and the world be made beautiful. A reparation, a duty, and suddenly it was luminously clear to the savage what he must do. It was as though a shutter had been opened, a curtain drawn back. Now, said the deputy sub-bursar, another khaki female stepped forward. Stop, called the savage in a loud and ringing voice. Stop! He pushed his way to the table. The deltas stared at him with astonishment. Ford, the deputy sub-bursar below his breath. It's the savage. He felt scared. Listen, I beg of you, cried the savage earnestly. Lend me your ears. He had never spoken in public before, and found it very difficult to express what he wanted to say. Don't take that horrible stuff. It's poison. It's poison. I say, Mr. Savage, said the deputy sub-bursar, smiling propitiatingly. What the hell? Whatever. How do you know? I don't know how to pronounce that word. Would you mind letting me? Poison to soul as well as body. Yes, but let me get on with my distribution, won't you? There's a good fellow. With the cautious tenderness of one who strokes a notoriously vicious animal, he patted the savage arms. Just let me. Never, cried the savage. But look here, old man. Throw it all away, that horrible poison. The words, throw it all away, pierced through the enfolding layers of incomprehension to the quick of the delta's consciousness. An angry murmur went up from the crowd. I come... Oh, that's the end of my show. Thanks, Del, Dan, Grammy Mary, Jane, Joe, Chuana, Otto, Shirley, and Tuanons. I'll see you guys next week. Take care, everybody!
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of scientific.
My name is S.M. Gibson, and I am the host of Anti-Media Radio on UCY.